Welcome to History Teller YT, where the past comes alive. Today, we embark on an extraordinary journey across deserts, mountains, and seas through the legendary Silk Road, the greatest network of trade and culture the world has ever known. From the dynasties of China to the markets of Rome, from the monasteries of Tibet to the bazaars of Baghdad, from the mighty Mongol Empire to the fall of Constantinople. This is the story of how silk, spices, religions, and ideas connected east and west for more than 1,000 years. But the Silk Road was never just about goods. It was about human encounters, merchants, pilgrims, scholars, and adventurers who stitched the world together, sometimes with prosperity, sometimes with plague, but always with transformation. Stay with us, because by the end of this journey, you will see how the Silk Road was not only a road of history, it was the first blueprint of globalization. This is the full story you've been waiting for, told only here on History Teller YT. The story of the Silk Road begins more than 2,000 years ago in the heart of ancient China. During the reign of the Han Dynasty in the 2nd century BCE, Emperor Wu sought to extend Chinese influence and open channels for both diplomacy and commerce. One of his envoys, Zheng, traveled westward into Central Asia, encountering civilizations previously unknown to China. These journeys revealed horses of great strength, advanced military techniques, and exotic goods that could enrich the empire. Thus began the weaving of a complex web of land routes that would later be known as the Silk Road. Although silk was not the only commodity exchanged, it became the most celebrated, representing luxury, prestige, and cultural refinement. From Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, in China, caravans carried bolts of fine silk westward, while spices, gems, and glassware traveled east. The road was not a single path, but a network of trails, oases, and caravanserais stretching thousands of kilometers, passing through deserts like the Taklamakan and cities like Samarkand and Bokhara. Early merchants risked bandits, harsh climates, and long treks. Yet the profits were so immense that trade flourished. Over time, these connections did more than move goods. They moved ideas, religions, and technologies, transforming distant lands into participants of a shared human story. The Silk Road thus emerged not only as an economic lifeline, but also as a cultural bridge linking east and west. The Silk Road was never a straight highway, but a shifting series of trails shaped by the land itself. Geography dictated its routes, forcing merchants to adapt to landscapes both beautiful and deadly. At the eastern edge, the fertile plains of the Yellow River Basin allowed China to produce silk, ceramics, and iron goods. But to move westward, traders had to cross the fearsome Gobi Desert, a place of scorching days, freezing nights, and treacherous sandstorms. Beyond it loomed the Taklamakan, often called the Desert of Death, where ancient travelers whispered that once you entered, there was little chance of return. To bypass such dangers, merchants relied on narrow corridors along the northern and southern edges, stopping at oasis towns like Dunhuang, Khotan, and Kashgar, where water and safety awaited. These oases became vital hubs, growing rich from the constant flow of goods and travelers. Beyond the deserts, towering mountains presented new trials. The Pamirs, known as the roof of the world, demanded stamina to climb their icy passes. Farther west, the Zagros and Caucasus ranges tested endurance and courage. Yet, geography was not only an obstacle, it shaped the character of the Silk Road. The mountains preserved cultural enclaves, deserts forced collaboration, and rivers like the Imuk Darya carried boats filled with goods. By compelling merchants to stop, rest, and trade at key crossroads, the land itself created the nodes of exchange where east met west. Without the harsh deserts and perilous mountains, the Silk Road would not have formed its unique rhythm of travel, danger, and opportunity. Geography, in essence, was both the Silk Road's greatest enemy and its most loyal architect. The earliest traders on the Silk Road were not powerful empires, but small groups of daring merchants and nomads. Central Asian nomadic tribes, such as the Sogdians and the Yuezhi, acted as middlemen, guiding caravans through lands they knew intimately. The Sogdians in particular became legendary as the Silk Road's first great merchants. They spoke multiple languages, wrote contracts, and established communities in distant markets from Chang'an to Constantinople. For them, the road was more than commerce. It was a lifeline linking scattered peoples. Early Chinese traders carried silk, lacquerware, jade, and iron implements. In return, they received fine horses from Fergana, glass from Rome, wool from Persia, and precious stones from India. But trade was never just material. Buddhism, born in India, began spreading eastward along these same routes, carried by monks who joined caravans for protection. By the 1st century CE, Buddhist texts and art had reached China, transforming its spiritual landscape. Meanwhile, Chinese technologies such as papermaking and bronze casting began trickling westward. Caravanserais, fortified and spaced along the route, allowed travelers of diverse cultures to rest, share stories, and learn from one another. A Roman merchant could eat Persian bread, drink Central Asian wine, and discuss philosophy with an Indian monk, all under one roof. These encounters created a cultural mosaic, turning the Silk Road into the world's first true melting pot. Suspicion and rivalry certainly existed, but so did trust, kinship, and curiosity. Over time, generations of traders forged bonds stronger than borders, ensuring the Silk Road would endure as more than just a highway of silk, but as a road of ideas, faiths, and friendships. The Silk Road owes much of its birth to the ambitions of the Han Dynasty, one of China's greatest imperial powers. In the 2nd century BCE, Emperor Wu of Han faced a problem. Nomadic tribes such as the Xiongnu threatened China's northern borders, raiding settlements and blocking expansion. Seeking alliances with other tribes that could help counter the Xiongnu, Emperor Wu dispatched an envoy named Zheng on a daring mission westward. Though captured and held by the Xiongnu for years, Zheng eventually escaped and traveled deep into Central Asia, encountering new cultures and goods that astonished him. He discovered the famed Fergana horses, animals of such strength and endurance that they seemed divine compared to China's native breeds. These heavenly horses became a key military asset, and acquiring them justified opening routes towards Central Asia. Zhang Qian's reports convinced the Han court that trade and diplomacy beyond China's borders held immense value. His journey revealed a world of opportunities, kingdoms like Bactria, Parthia, and Sogdiana that could become allies and trading partners. More importantly, his mission marked the first official Chinese step toward what would become the Silk Road. The Han states soon began sending caravans west, filled with bolts of silk, lacquerware, and ceramics. In return, China gained horses, jade, and new crops like grapes and alfalfa. By linking its imperial ambitions to commerce, the Han Dynasty transformed what had been isolated trails into a deliberate network of international exchange. Zhang Qian, though only one man, became a symbol of cross-cultural contact, remembered as the father of the Silk Road. Once the Han recognized the potential of these westward connections, they invested heavily in infrastructure and military power to secure the routes. The Han armies pushed the Xiongnu tribes farther into the steppes, reclaiming territory and establishing garrisons to guard strategic passes. Outposts were constructed at intervals, each staffed with soldiers and administrators who monitored caravans and collected taxes. The Great Wall itself was extended during this period, not only as a defensive barrier, but as a way to protect merchants from nomadic raids. Yet military power alone was insufficient. The Han also built an administrative framework to encourage trade. Passports and permits were introduced for travelers, ensuring security and regulation across long distances. Caravanserais, resting places for merchants, were supported or supervised by the state, reducing risks and strengthening loyalty to the empire. By making the routes safer, the Han encouraged more merchants to participate, which in turn enriched both the imperial treasury and frontier communities. This system also gave rise to a new professional class of traders who specialized in long-distance commerce, rather than local exchange. The empire's attention to infrastructure was not purely economic, it was strategic. By keeping merchants loyal and prosperous, the Han ensured a steady flow of wealth and intelligence from distant lands. Information about Rome, Persia, and India filtered into China through these channels, expanding the horizons of Chinese knowledge. The Han dynasty's blend of military strength, administrative control, and economic incentives laid the foundation for the Silk Road as a sustainable, long-term network, rather than a temporary path for daring adventurers. Beyond goods and profits, the Han dynasty presided over some of the earliest major cultural exchanges along the Silk Road. Chinese silk quickly became a global sensation, highly coveted in Central Asia, Persia, and Rome. Roman aristocrats draped themselves in translucent silk garments, sparking debates in the Senate about luxury and moral decay. To China, however, foreign goods carried equal fascination. From India came Buddhist monks and missionaries, carrying sacred texts and stories that would later transform Chinese spirituality. Early Buddhist influences reached China in the 1st century CE, setting the stage for a religious revolution that would flourish in later centuries. From Persia and Central Asia came new technologies, improved saddles and stirrups that enhanced cavalry warfare, glassware that dazzled Chinese artisans, and new fruits like grapes, pomegranates, and walnuts that enriched the Chinese diet. Even music and dance crossed borders, with Central Asian instruments like the lute inspiring Chinese court music. These cultural imports blended seamlessly with native traditions, shaping Chinese society in ways both subtle and profound. At the same time, Chinese innovations such as papermaking began to spread westward, slowly altering the intellectual life of distant civilizations. What made the Silk Road so unique was not the one-way movement of ideas, but the reciprocity. Every culture that touched the road gave something and received something in return. The Han Dynasty, by stabilizing the routes and encouraging these exchanges, created not just an economy, but a dialogue between civilizations. This dialogue would grow stronger over centuries, ensuring that the Silk Road became the single greatest conduit of cultural interaction in the ancient world. While China and Rome are often remembered as the two poles of the Silk Road, it was Central Asia that functioned as the network's beating heart. Stretching from the edges of the Taklamakan Desert to the steppes of Kazakhstan and the mountains of Afghanistan, this region contained the arteries through which goods, ideas, and people flowed. Central Asia was not simply a space to be crossed. It was an active participant in the shaping of the Silk Road. The region's geography created natural meeting points. Fertile valleys like Fergana, thriving oasis towns like Samarkand, and crucial crossroads like Bactria and Sogdiana. These places were more than rest stops. They were bustling cities where merchants exchanged languages, religions, and technologies. Central Asia's nomadic peoples also played a critical role, guiding caravans through difficult terrain and providing protection in exchange for tolls or goods. Unlike the great empires of China and Rome, which often viewed the Silk Road as a means of projecting power, Central Asian societies saw it as life itself. Their economies, politics, and identities were bound to trade. Camels and horses bred in these lands became the essential vehicles of Silk Road commerce, their endurance making possible the transport of silk, spices, glass, and gold across thousands of miles. The traders of Central Asia, especially the Sogdians, developed into cultural ambassadors, spreading Buddhism into China, Zoroastrianism into Central Asia, and artistic motifs that blended Persian, Indian, and Greek influences. Without Central Asia, the Silk Road would have been impossible, for it was here at the crossroads of empires that East and West became entwined in daily life. Among the many Central Asian peoples, the Sogdians stood out as the quintessential Silk Road merchants. Originating from the fertile region of Sogdiana, centered on Samarkand and Bokhara, they built a trading empire not through conquest, but through networks of kinship and commerce. Fluent in multiple languages, skilled in accounting, and adept at diplomacy, Sogdians became indispensable middlemen. They established permanent trading colonies in cities across China, Persia, and even India, marrying into local communities and creating cultural bridges wherever they settled. Sogdian caravans carried Chinese silk to the markets of Persia, Byzantine glassware to China, and Indian spices across the deserts. They also became conduits of religion, helping spread Buddhism from India into East Asia and later facilitating the transmission of Nestorian Christianity and Manichaeism. Their artistic legacy was equally profound. Sogdian murals depict lively banquets, hunting scenes, and processions of camels laden with goods, capturing the vibrancy of Silk Road life. Even the Chinese court recognized their value, granting them special privileges as interpreters and envoys. Yet the Sogdians were not only merchants, they were cultural translators. They helped shape the cosmopolitan atmosphere of the Silk Road by blending elements from multiple civilizations into a unique identity that was neither wholly Chinese, Persian, nor Indian. This adaptability allowed them to survive political upheavals, from Han control to Persian dominance, and eventually under the shadow of the rising Islamic Caliphate. In a grand story of the Silk Road, the Sogdians demonstrate how merchants could wield as much influence as kings, turning commerce into a form of power and diplomacy that reshaped the ancient world. Central Asia's importance on the Silk Road was magnified by the constant collisions of empires that shaped its history. After Alexander the Great's conquests in the 4th century BCE, Greek culture blended with local traditions to create the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. This fusion produced extraordinary art, where Greek sculptural techniques gave form to Buddhist imagery, resulting in the serene Gandhara Buddhas that would later inspire East Asian depictions of the Enlightened One. Persia, too, exerted enormous influence. The Parthians and later the Sassanids controlled key stretches of the Silk Road, acting as gatekeepers between Rome and the East. They taxed caravans, offered protection, and enriched their empires with goods flowing through their domains. Meanwhile, India's role was equally critical. From its northern regions, merchants sent ivory, spices, and precious stones, while monks carried Buddhist teachings that reshaped the spiritual lives of Central Asia and China. The Kushan Empire, straddling India and Central Asia in the early century CE, became a major force in this exchange, sponsoring Buddhist monasteries along the trade routes and minting coins that reflected a cosmopolitan blend of Greek, Persian, and Indian deities. These overlapping spheres of influence turned Central Asia into a laboratory of cultural fusion. where architecture, religion, and art absorbed elements from multiple traditions. For travelers, the region was both a marketplace and a museum, filled with languages, gods, and philosophies in constant dialogue. The clashes and collaborations of Persia, Greece, and India in Central Asia ensured that the Silk Road was never static. It was dynamic, changing with every empire that left its mark. In this ever-shifting landscape, Central Asia remained the indispensable hinge upon which the fortunes of East and West turned. By the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire had grown into one of the greatest powers of the ancient world, stretching from Britain to Egypt and from Spain to Mesopotamia. At its far eastern edge, Rome brushed against the borders of the Parthian Empire, a critical intermediary between the Mediterranean world and Asia. Through these channels, Rome began to encounter one of China's most exquisite exports, silk. To Roman elites, silk was unlike anything they had ever seen, light, translucent, and shimmering with beauty. Women of the aristocracy draped themselves in silk gowns that revealed the body beneath, sparking moral debates in the Senate about luxury, decadence, and foreign influence. Roman writers such as Seneca and Pliny the Elder criticized silk as corrupting Roman virtue, lamenting that vast sums of gold were leaving Rome in exchange for a cloth that weakened morals. Yet despite these criticisms, the appetite for silk only grew stronger. Merchants from Palmyra, Petra, and Antioch managed trade between Rome and the East, paying heavy tolls to Parthian rulers who controlled the caravan routes. Roman demand for silk, spices, and gems created a massive outflow of wealth, worrying emperors but enriching merchants. This demand ensured that caravans never ceased their perilous journeys across deserts and mountains. Silk became a symbol of status, a mark of Rome's cosmopolitan reach, and proof that even the most powerful empire depended on distant lands for luxury. Through silk, Rome was drawn into the global web of commerce, tethered to China by threads that crossed thousands of miles of hostile terrain. While Rome eagerly imported silk, it also exported goods that became highly prized in the East. Roman glassware, with its vibrant colors and delicate craftsmanship, fascinated Chinese elites, who viewed it as exotic and valuable. Silver and gold coins bearing the profiles of emperors traveled far into Central Asia, sometimes hoarded as treasure, sometimes melted down into ornaments. Wine from the Mediterranean vineyards also found its way along the trade routes, though it often had to be adapted to local tastes and climates. In exchange, Rome received spices such as pepper, cinnamon, and cloves from India, creating culinary revolutions in Roman kitchens. Ivory, pearls, and gemstones enriched Roman jewelry, while incense from Arabia fueled religious ceremonies. Yet goods were only one part of the exchange. The Silk Road also carried cultural impressions. Roman art and architectural motifs spread eastward, influencing designs in Persia and beyond. In turn, Rome absorbed Eastern ideas, including astrological knowledge from Mesopotamia and medical practices from India. Philosophical schools of thought also traveled, as Stoic and Greek ideas encountered Eastern spiritual traditions. Though Rome never reached China directly, the two empires communicated only indirectly through intermediaries. Their cultural footprints overlapped along the road. The Roman presence on the Silk Road demonstrated that trade was not confined to commodities. It was also an intellectual and spiritual conversation. Each caravan not only carried goods, but carried glimpses of other worlds, feeding the curiosity and imagination of both East and West. Despite its fascination with silk and Eastern luxuries, Rome never fully penetrated the Silk Road in the way China did. Geography, politics, and rival empires limited direct contact. The Parthians and later the Sassanids acted as gatekeepers, controlling key routes and charging high taxes that enriched their coffers. Rome's attempts to bypass these middlemen often failed. Expeditions into Arabia and the Red Sea sought alternative sea routes, leading to Roman contact with Indian ports through the monsoon winds. These maritime connections became crucial, allowing goods to flow more directly between the Mediterranean and South Asia without the long overland trek. Still, the dream of direct contact with China lingered. Roman historians recorded vague accounts of distant Syries, a people who produced silk, but details remained clouded by myth. In the 2nd century CE, an embassy supposedly sent by Marcus Aurelius reached the Chinese court, though historians debate whether it was truly Roman or merely a group of traders claiming imperial authority. Even if real, this meeting was an exception rather than the rule. For the most part, Rome's involvement in the Silk Road remained indirect, filtered through Persia, Central Asia, and Indian intermediaries. Yet Rome's influence was undeniable. By creating immense demand for luxury goods, Rome fueled the Silk Road's vitality. Its wealth, markets, and cultural prestige helped turn the road into a global system. Though separated by thousands of miles, Rome and China were bound together by commerce, each shaping the other in ways neither fully understood. In this sense, Rome stood as the Silk Road's western anchor, the place where eastern threads finally reached the edge of the known world. The Kushan Empire emerged in the 1st century CE as one of the most influential powers along the Silk Road. Founded by the Yuezhi, a nomadic group originally displaced from western China by the Xiongnu, the Kushans migrated into Bactria and northern India, establishing a kingdom that spanned Afghanistan, Pakistan, and parts of Central Asia. Their territory sat at a critical junction between China, India, and the Greco-Roman world, making them natural facilitators of Silk Road trade. Unlike many empires that sought to close borders, the Kushans thrived by opening them. Their rulers encouraged merchants, tolerated diverse religions, and minted coins that reflected their multicultural society. On Kushan coins, one can see depictions of Greek gods, Persian deities, Indian figures, and even Buddhist symbols, all existing side by side. This eclectic imagery reflected their role as cultural brokers. The Kushans controlled key segments of the road leading through the Hindu Kush Mountains, providing safe passage for caravans laden with silk, spices, glassware, ivory, and precious stones. They established prosperous cities like Gandhara, which became both trade hubs and centers of cultural exchange. By uniting vast regions under their rule, the Kushans created political stability that allowed goods and ideas to move more freely. They were not merely passive intermediaries, but active architects of the Silk Road, fostering conditions that transformed the network into a channel not only of commerce, but of intellectual and spiritual change. Among the Kushans' most enduring contributions was their role in spreading Buddhism along the Silk Road. Under rulers such as Kanish the Great, the empire became a powerful patron of the Buddhist faith. Kanish convened a great Buddhist council in Kashmir, where scholars and monks gathered to codify sacred texts and philosophical teachings. From the Kushan capital at Peshawar, modern-day Peshawar, missionaries were dispatched across Central Asia and into China, carrying with them scriptures, relics, and images of the Buddha. The Kushans were instrumental in transforming Buddhism from a primarily Indian tradition into a truly international religion. Along the trade routes, monasteries were built as both spiritual sanctuaries and rest stops for merchants. These monasteries offered food, lodging, and protection, encouraging traders to support them with donations. In return, Monks spread Buddhist teachings not only to local populations, but also to travelers who carried those ideas onward. The Gandhara region under the Kushans produced some of the most remarkable Buddhist art in history. Sculptors combined Greek naturalism with Indian spirituality, creating lifelike statues of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas. These images traveled with merchants and monks, profoundly influencing Chinese and later Japanese representations of the Buddha. The Kushan Empire thus acted as both protector and promoter of Buddhism, ensuring that it became deeply entwined with the cultural exchanges of the Silk Road. Their support transformed Buddhism into one of the road's greatest exports, rivaling silk itself in its influence on civilizations from Samarkand to Kyoto. The Kushan Empire's cultural impact extended beyond politics and religion into art, philosophy, and intellectual life. Nowhere is this more evident than in Gandhara art, which flourished under Kushan rule. In the cities of Gandhara, artisans blended Hellenistic techniques left behind by Alexander's successors with Indian themes and Buddhist devotion. The result was an artistic style that depicted the Buddha in flowing robes reminiscent of Greek sculptures, with serene facial expressions that conveyed both human dignity and divine tranquility. These statues were revolutionary, as earlier Buddhist traditions had often avoided direct human representations of the Buddha, using symbols like footprints or the Bodhi tree instead. The Kushan-sponsored Gandhara art thus set the standard for Buddhist iconography across Asia. Beyond art, the Kushans were also conduits for intellectual exchange. They adopted elements of Persian administration, Greek language and science, and Indian literature and philosophy, weaving them into a hybrid culture that thrived on diversity. Their empire became a living library where ideas from different civilizations interacted. Medical knowledge from India moved westward, while Greek astronomy and mathematics flowed eastward. Legal concepts, literary styles, and architectural designs all crossed borders in Kushan-controlled territories. This intellectual environment not only enriched their own society, but also laid foundations for later cultural renaissances in Central Asia and China. The Kushan Empire may not have lasted as long as Rome or Han China, but its role as a cultural and religious bridge was monumental. By fostering trade, supporting Buddhism, and nurturing hybrid art forms, the Kushans ensured their place as one of the most significant contributors to the flourishing of the Silk Road. The Parthian Empire, which rose after the decline of Alexander's successors, held sway over Persia from the 3rd century BCE to the 3rd century CE. Situated between Rome in the west and Han China in the east, the Parthians controlled one of the most strategic portions of the Silk Road. Their position gave them immense power as middlemen, allowing them to dictate the flow of goods and ideas across their territory. The Parthians were skilled horsemen and warriors, famed for their deadly Parthian shot, a cavalry tactic of firing arrows while retreating at full gallop. This military strength helped them resist Roman invasions and maintain autonomy over key routes. Yet, unlike empires that built massive bureaucracies, the Parthians governed loosely, allowing local rulers significant autonomy. This flexibility meant that trade could flourish without heavy-handed interference. Caravans passing through Parthian lands carried silk, spices, and gems toward the Mediterranean, while glass, wine, and silver moved east. The Parthians became wealthy from taxing these caravans, essentially monetizing geography. But their influence was not only economic. By managing relations with both Rome and China, they acted as diplomatic intermediaries, ensuring that even though the two great empires rarely communicated directly, goods and information continued to flow between them. For centuries, the Parthians stood as indispensable gatekeepers, their empire functioning like a toll station on history's greatest highway. Without their balancing act, the fragile connections of the Silk Road might have collapsed under the pressure of imperial rivalries. When the Parthian Empire eventually weakened, it was replaced by the Sassanids in the 3rd century CE. The Sassanid dynasty, proud heirs to the Persian imperial tradition, ruled until the rise of Islam in the 7th century and became even more formidable gatekeepers of the Silk Road. Unlike the decentralized Parthians, the Sassanids built a strong central administration, enforcing taxes, maintaining armies, and asserting tighter control over trade routes. Their capital at Ctesiphon became a jewel of commerce, filled with goods from across Eurasia. Sassanid Persia was not merely a transit point, it was also a producer. Persian textiles, silverware, and luxury items traveled alongside Chinese silk and Indian spices, creating a brand of Persian elegance that became admired in both East and West. The Sassanids also invested in infrastructure, caravanserais, roads, and fortified towns that secured trade routes across their lands. However, their dominance also meant friction with Rome and later Byzantium, as both empires struggled to bypass Persian tolls. This rivalry sometimes erupted into wars that disrupted trade, but paradoxically, the very value of controlling the Silk Road ensured that neither side could abandon it completely. Beyond economics, the Sassanids shaped the cultural exchanges of the Silk Road. Zoroastrian fire temples stood along trade routes, influencing religious thought, while Persian art and motifs spread widely, leaving their imprint on Byzantine mosaics and Central Asian designs alike. By combining political might, economic control, and cultural influence, the Sassanids elevated Persia from mere gatekeeper to active shaper of the Silk Road's destiny. The Parthians and Sassanids were more than toll collectors. They were cultural and diplomatic actors who left a profound legacy on Silk Road history. Diplomatically, both dynasties managed delicate relationships with China, Rome, and later Byzantium. Chinese records mention embassies sent by Parthians, who sought to secure alliances and gain prestige by linking themselves to distant powers. These exchanges may have been limited, but they reveal a world increasingly aware of its interconnectedness. Culturally, Persia's role was even more significant. Persian motifs in clothing, silverware, and architecture spread along the Silk Road, blending with Indian, Greek, and Chinese styles. Their artistic synthesis created hybrid forms that symbolized the very spirit of the Silk Road: diversity in unity. Religiously, Persia became a crossroads of faiths. Zoroastrianism remained dominant, but Christianity, Buddhism, and later Manichaeism found communities in Persian lands. The Sassanids, while often intolerant of rival religions, could not stop their spread along the roads. The Parthians and Sassanids also influenced military technology, passing along innovations in cavalry equipment that reshaped warfare across Eurasia. Their greatest legacy, however, was ensuring that the Silk Road remained intact during times of shifting power. By serving as both barriers and bridges, they preserved the delicate flow of goods and ideas. When Islam arose in the 7th century, much of the Persian infrastructure and administrative tradition was absorbed into the new Islamic caliphates, ensuring continuity. Thus, the Parthians and Sassanids not only shaped their era, but laid the groundwork for the Silk Road survival into the medieval world, securing Persia's reputation as the eternal crossroads of civilizations. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE, the Byzantine Empire inherited Rome's role as the Mediterranean anchor of the Silk Road. Centered in Constantinople, one of the most strategically located cities in history, Byzantium controlled the passage between Europe and Asia. Its geographic position at the Bosporus Strait made it both a marketplace and a gatekeeper, drawing merchants from across Eurasia. For Byzantium, silk remained the ultimate symbol of prestige. While Rome had once imported it through Parthian and Sassanid intermediaries, the Byzantines sought to control silk production themselves. In the 6th century, 2 monks are said to have smuggled silkworm eggs from China hidden in hollowed-out staffs. With this bold act of espionage, Byzantium gained the ability to produce silk domestically, breaking China's monopoly. From then on, Constantinople became one of the world's silk capitals, weaving exquisite fabrics dyed in imperial purple that were reserved for royalty. The Byzantine state tightly regulated silk, restricting production and sale to ensure its status as both a luxury and a political weapon. Diplomatically, silk became a tool to cement alliances. Emperors gifted embroidered robes to foreign rulers, projecting wealth and superiority. Economically, Byzantium turned into the western terminus of the Silk Road, connecting caravan goods arriving from Persia with ships bound for Venice, Alexandria, and beyond. Byzantium thus stood as both a consumer and producer, shaping the luxury markets of Europe and ensuring the Silk Road continued to thrive, even as political borders shifted and empires rose and fell. Byzantium was more than a silk workshop. It was the hub of a vast network that linked Europe to Asia and Africa. Merchants from Constantinople traded not only silk, but also glassware, wine, and olive oil, exchanging them for spices, gems, and textiles from the east. The Byzantine Navy ensured that Mediterranean shipping lanes remained relatively safe, allowing goods arriving via land routes to continue westward by sea. However, Byzantium's position also placed it in constant rivalry with its eastern neighbors, particularly the Sassanids. Wars between the Byzantines and Persians often disrupted Silk Road commerce, forcing traders to seek alternative routes through the Arabian Peninsula or the steppes. Despite these conflicts, trade never ceased entirely. The profits were too great, and even warring empires recognized the necessity of commerce. Byzantium's rivalry extended beyond Persia. Venice and other Italian city-states grew increasingly wealthy by monopolizing the Mediterranean leg of the Silk Road. These maritime republics acted as Byzantium's partners and competitors, distributing goods to Western Europe and gradually undermining Constantinople's dominance. At the same time, Byzantium faced pressure from nomadic powers like the Avars, Bulgars, and later the Seljuk Turks, who threatened the empire's control over key trade corridors. Yet the empire's resilience lay in its adaptability. By shifting alliances, leveraging its navy, and maintaining strict control over silk production, Byzantium managed to keep itself central to Eurasian trade for centuries. Its survival as the Silk Road's western hub highlights the empire's role not only as a political power, but as a vital economic and cultural mediator between worlds. Beyond economics, Byzantium played a vital role in cultural and religious exchanges along the Silk Road. As a bastion of Christianity, it became both a missionary center and a theological powerhouse. Monks, priests, and pilgrims traveled eastward, carrying Christian texts and doctrines, while Eastern monks and mystics arrived in Constantinople, enriching Byzantine spiritual life. The Nestorian Christians, who established communities in Persia and Central Asia, maintained connections to Byzantium even while doctrinal disputes divided the church. Byzantine art and architecture, characterized by golden mosaics and domed churches, also left a mark far beyond the empire's borders. Silk adorned with Christian motifs traveled east, while Persian and Islamic artistic styles influenced Byzantine designs. Philosophy and science flowed in both directions. Greek texts preserved in Byzantium eventually traveled eastward, influencing Islamic scholars, while knowledge from Persia and India entered Byzantine intellectual circles. The empire also became a stage for diplomacy between distant cultures. Envoys from China, Central Asia, and even the Islamic caliphates appeared at the Byzantine court, marveling at the grandeur of Hagia Sophia and the riches of Constantinople. Through these interactions, Byzantium acted as a mirror and mediator, reflecting the East to the West and vice versa. Its role as a cultural crossroads ensured that the Silk Road was not only about goods, but also about ideas, faiths, and artistic traditions. Even as it fought wars and navigated rivalries, Byzantium's ability to absorb and transmit cultural influences kept it central to the Silk Road story. In many ways, the Byzantine Empire was less a fortress guarding Europe than a bridge connecting continents, peoples, and civilizations. The rise of Islam in the 7th century CE transformed the Silk Road in ways both immediate and lasting. Within a century of the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 CE, the Arab armies of the Rashidun and Umayyad caliphates had conquered vast territories stretching from Spain in the west to the Indus Valley in the east. This unprecedented expansion united lands that had long been fragmented under different empires. Where once merchants had to navigate the rivalries of Byzantium, Persia, and countless smaller states, they now found themselves traveling under the protection of a single overarching authority, the Caliphate. The concept of a shared Islamic world, the Dar al-Islam, encouraged trade by creating cultural familiarity across regions as diverse as Egypt, Persia, and Central Asia. Arabic became the lingua franca of commerce, while Islamic law provided a shared legal framework for contracts, taxation, and dispute resolution. Cities such as Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo became vibrant trading hubs, connecting overland routes with maritime ones that linked the Persian Gulf and Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. The Arab caliphates did not simply inherit the Silk Road. They revitalized it, ensuring its survival during a time of great political upheaval. Merchants, caravans, and sailors now traveled with a sense of belonging to a broader community where shared religion, language, and law created trust. In many ways, Islam's spread created the conditions for a golden age of Silk Road commerce, one that saw the blending of cultures under the Crescent Banner. When the Abbasid Caliphate replaced the Umayyads in 750 CE, the center of Islamic power shifted to Baghdad, a city deliberately founded on the banks of the Tigris River to control both land and water routes. Baghdad quickly became one of the greatest cities of the medieval world, known as the Round City for its unique circular design. Under the Abbasids, the Silk Road reached new heights of cultural and intellectual flourishing. Caravans carried Chinese silk, Indian spices, African ivory, and Byzantine glassware into the bazaars of Baghdad, where merchants from across the known world haggled in crowded markets. Yet Baghdad was not only a commercial capital, it was also the beating heart of the Islamic Golden Age. The House of Wisdom, a great library and research institution, attracted scholars from Persia, India, Greece, and beyond. Scientific texts in astronomy, medicine, and mathematics were translated into Arabic, preserving ancient knowledge while also generating new discoveries. Paper, introduced from China after the Battle of Talas in 751 CE, revolutionized learning, making books cheaper and more accessible. This intellectual boom spread along the Silk Road, as traveling scholars carried books, instruments, and ideas across continents. Religion also played a key role. Islamic values encouraged trade, with the Prophet Muhammad himself having been a merchant. Pilgrimage routes to Mecca and Medina intertwined with commercial ones, ensuring steady flows of people and ideas. In this period, the Silk Road became more than a highway of goods. It became a highway of knowledge, with Baghdad at its shining center. One of the greatest contributions of the Islamic world to the Silk Road was the expansion of maritime trade. While caravans continued to cross deserts and mountains, Muslim merchants increasingly turned to the seas, using the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean to link China, India, East Africa, and the Mediterranean. Arab sailors mastered the use of the monsoon winds, enabling them to cross vast distances with predictable regularity. Ports such as Basra, Aden, and later Calicut became nodes of a maritime Silk Road that complemented the overland routes. From East Africa came gold, slaves, and ivory. From India came pepper, cotton, and gems. From China came porcelain and silk. In return, Islamic merchants carried textiles, glass, and metalwork eastward. These maritime connections extended the Silk Road's reach, effectively globalizing trade by linking the Mediterranean not only to Asia, but also to Africa and beyond. Cultural exchanges followed the goods. Islam spread along coastal regions of Africa and Southeast Asia, creating Muslim communities in places as far apart as Zanzibar and Java. Mosques rose in port cities, blending local architectural traditions with Islamic designs. Arabic words entered languages like Swahili and Malay, reflecting the depth of this exchange. Maritime trade also strengthened the Islamic world's financial systems. Innovations such as letters of credit, bills of exchange, and banking houses allowed merchants to trade across thousands of miles without carrying massive sums of gold. These tools laid the groundwork for modern finance. By mastering both land and sea routes, the Arab caliphates ensured that the Silk Road was not merely revived. It was expanded into a global system of exchange, carrying with it the faith, science, and culture of Islam. The Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, is often regarded as one of China's golden ages, not only for its internal prosperity, but also for the vibrancy it brought to the Silk Road. After centuries of turmoil during the collapse of the Han and the rise and fall of short-lived dynasties, the Tang restored unity and order to China, allowing trade routes to reopen with renewed vigor. Chang'an, the Tang capital, became one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the world, its streets filled with merchants, pilgrims, envoys, and adventurers from across Eurasia. The Tang emperors actively supported trade, investing in roads, relay stations, and postal systems that facilitated both military control and commercial movement. Unlike earlier dynasties, the Tang court embraced cosmopolitanism, welcoming foreign embassies and allowing merchants from as far as Persia, Arabia, and India to establish thriving communities within Chinese cities. Caravanserais and markets buzzed with languages from across the world, creating an atmosphere where cultural exchange was as natural as commerce. The Tang also benefited from China's technological and agricultural advances, such as improved irrigation, tea cultivation, and porcelain production, which increased the empire's export capacity. In return, they imported exotic luxuries: glass from the Middle East, spices from India, horses from Central Asia, and even musical instruments that would reshape Chinese court music. The Tang dynasty thus reopened and elevated the Silk Road into a channel of global significance, where wealth, knowledge, and culture flowed more freely than ever before. At the heart of Tang China's Silk Road activity was Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, a metropolis that dazzled visitors with its size and splendor. With a population estimated at over 1 million, it was larger than most European cities combined and serve as the terminus of both land and maritime Silk Road routes. The city was laid out in a grand grid pattern with wide avenues, bustling markets, and distinct quarters for foreign communities. Merchants from Sogdiana, Persia, Arabia, and even distant Byzantium maintained enclaves where they spoke their native tongues, practiced their religions, and introduced their cuisines. In Chang'an, one could hear the chanting of Buddhist monks, the prayers of Zoroastrian fire worshippers, and the call to prayer from early Muslim communities, all coexisting within a vibrant urban fabric. Tang rulers tolerated and even encouraged this diversity, seeing it as a symbol of their empire's prestige. The markets of Chang'an were a microcosm of the Silk Road itself, offering silks, ceramics, and paper alongside Persian carpets, Indian spices, and Roman glass. The city's theaters hosted dancers and musicians from Central Asia, while its temples displayed statues influenced by Indian and Greek artistic traditions. Diplomats from neighboring states brought tribute, adding to the cosmopolitan flavor. Chang'an's openness not only enriched Chinese culture, but also projected China's image as the cultural and economic center of the world. For many travelers, to reach Chang'an was to reach the beating heart of civilization, a place where East and West met on equal footing. One of the most transformative aspects of the Tang dynasty's role in the Silk Road was the flourishing of Buddhism. While the religion had entered China centuries earlier, it was during the Tang period that it reached its greatest influence. Pilgrims such as Xuanzang traveled from China to India, collecting scriptures and returning with invaluable knowledge. His journey inspired the famous tale Journey to the West, which blended myth and history into one of China's most beloved stories. Monasteries sprang up along the Silk Road, offering rest for merchants and spreading Buddhist teachings across Asia. At the same time, Tang art and culture absorbed and reinterpreted foreign influences. Buddhist cave complexes such as Dunhuang became treasure troves of murals, sculptures, and manuscripts that depicted not only religious stories, but also scenes of daily life along the Silk Road. These artworks revealed a cultural synthesis. Indian iconography blended with Chinese styles, while Central Asian motifs adorned Chinese temples. Even Tang poetry reflected this cosmopolitanism, with poets like Li Bai and Wang Wei drawing inspiration from foreign lands and encounters. Beyond religion and art, the Tang dynasty exported innovations of its own. Papermaking, which had spread from China under the Han, now reached the Islamic world in Europe through Tang connections, laying the groundwork for future revolutions in learning. Gunpowder, tea, and porcelain also began their journeys outward, changing global history. The Tang era thus marked not only the height of China's Silk Road prosperity, but also one of the greatest periods of cultural fusion in world history. In Tang China, the Silk Road was more than trade. It was the soul of an interconnected world. The Tibetan Plateau, often called the roof of the world, played a critical though often overlooked role in Silk Road history. Towering above much of Asia, this vast highland region, spanning present-day Tibet, Nepal, Bhutan, and parts of India and China, posed immense challenges to traders and travelers. Its altitude made breathing difficult. Its climate shifted from blistering sun to deadly snowstorms within hours, and its rugged passes tested even the most resilient caravans. Yet, far from being an isolated wilderness, the Tibetan Plateau became a vital crossroads linking South Asia, East Asia, and Central Asia. Its geography created natural corridors through the Himalayas, such as the passes of Ladakh and routes through Kashmir, which served as arteries for trade. From India, merchants brought textiles, spices, ivory, and Buddhism itself. From China, Caravans carried silk, tea, and porcelain. From Central Asia came horses, jade, and salt. Tibetan traders themselves specialized in unique commodities such as highland wool, yak hides, musk, and medicinal herbs, which were highly prized in distant markets. Salt caravans, in particular, were iconic, as herders transported massive quantities of salt from Tibetan lakes to lowland regions, exchanging them for grain and luxury goods. The plateau's harsh environment did not prevent exchange, it demanded it. People of the highlands relied on trade to access what the land could not provide, while merchants from surrounding civilizations recognized Tibet as the indispensable bridge between Asia's great powers. Thus, geography, though forbidding, carved out a role for Tibet at the heart of Silk Road interconnections. By the 7th century CE, Tibet was no longer just a peripheral highland, but the seat of a powerful empire. Under the rule of Songtsen Gampo, the Tibetan Empire expanded across much of Central Asia, even challenging Tang China for dominance in key regions. Songtsen Gampo established alliances through marriage, most notably with a Chinese Tang princess, symbolizing the close yet contested relationship between Tibet and China. These alliances were not merely political, but also cultural. Through them, Buddhism was formally introduced into Tibet, where it would eventually flourish and become the foundation of Tibetan identity. Militarily, the Tibetan Empire was formidable, controlling vital passes and caravan routes that connected the Silk Road's northern and southern branches. By dominating these choke points, the Tibetans could tax traders, secure wealth, and influence the balance of power between neighboring empires. Lhasa, the Tibetan capital, became both a political and cultural center, where foreign merchants and envoys encountered Tibetan rulers. Though the empire eventually fragmented, its influence lingered for centuries. Even after its decline, Tibet remained a spiritual and cultural magnet, drawing pilgrims and traders alike. The Tibetan Empire's brief but powerful reign demonstrated how control over geography could elevate a seemingly peripheral land into a major Silk Road power. Tibet's military and cultural imprint ensured that the Himalayan crossroads remained essential in the global web of trade, diplomacy, and religious transformation. Perhaps Tibet's most enduring contribution to the Silk Road was its role as a religious crossroads. As Buddhism spread from India into Central and East Asia, Tibet became both a recipient and a transmitter of the faith. Pilgrims and monks braved treacherous mountain passes to reach monasteries, shrines, and sacred peaks like Mount Kailash, which was revered not only in Buddhism, but also in Hinduism, Jainism, and indigenous Tibetan traditions. These spiritual journeys intertwined with trade. Merchants often traveled alongside pilgrims for safety, while monasteries doubled as caravanserais, offering shelter and food. Over time, Tibetan Buddhism evolved into a unique form, blending Indian Buddhist philosophy with local Bon traditions. This syncretic faith radiated outward, influencing Mongolia, Central Asia, and even China. Artistic traditions also flourished. Think of paintings, intricately detailed scrolls depicting deities and mandalas traveled along Silk Road routes, spreading Tibetan aesthetics far beyond the plateau. Monks carried not only scriptures, but also medicinal knowledge, sharing herbal remedies and practices that were prized across Asia. In return, Tibet absorbed foreign influences. Chinese porcelain adorned monasteries. Persian textiles found their way into temples, and Indian philosophies shaped Tibetan scholastic traditions. Through these exchanges, Tibet was transformed from a remote mountain region into a vibrant participant in Eurasia's shared civilization. The Himalayas, once thought of as barriers, became bridges, carrying goods, ideas, and faiths across some of the world's most forbidding landscapes. In this way, the Tibetan Plateau was not a dead end of the Silk Road, but one of its most dynamic highland arteries, where trade and spirituality merged into a single path. The Abbasid Caliphate, especially during the 8th to 10th century CE, ushered in what historians call the Islamic Golden Age, and at its heart stood the magnificent city of Baghdad. Founded in 762 CE along the Tigris River, Baghdad became a hub where goods, scholars, and ideas converged from every corner of the Silk Road. Its famed house of wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, symbolized this intellectual blossoming. Sponsored by caliphs such as Al-Mansur and Al-Mamun, the House of Wisdom gathered scholars of diverse backgrounds, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian, to translate, preserve, and expand upon the knowledge of past civilizations. Texts from Greece, Persia, India, and even China were rendered into Arabic, making Baghdad a beacon of learning. Mathematics flourished as scholars like Al-Khwarizmi developed algebra and advanced algorithms, laying foundations that Europe would later adopt. In medicine, figures like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, revolutionized diagnosis, pharmacology, and surgery, producing texts that were studied for centuries. Astronomy, too, thrived as observatories charted the heavens with unprecedented precision, improving navigation for Silk Road travelers by both land and sea. Paper, introduced from China, became crucial for this intellectual revolution, allowing ideas to be widely copied and circulated. This environment of curiosity and exchange transformed Baghdad into more than a trade city. It became a global university without walls, where the Silk Road's flow of goods was matched by an equally vital flow of knowledge. The Islamic Golden Age was not only about preserving old knowledge, it was about creating new discoveries and transmitting them across the Silk Road. Muslim engineers refined technologies such as water clocks, astrolabes, and surgical instruments. Farmers introduced new irrigation techniques like cannets and Noria water wheels, which improved agricultural yield across arid lands. These technologies spread along the Silk Road, transforming local economies from Central Asia to Spain. The Islamic world also pioneered financial tools that made long-distance trade safer and more efficient. Bills of exchange, letters of credit, and early banking institutions allowed merchants to transfer wealth without the risk of carrying heavy coinage through dangerous terrain. These innovations laid the groundwork for global finance, centuries before modern banks. Meanwhile, artistic and cultural traditions blossomed. Islamic calligraphy and geometric art, shaped by religious prohibitions against figurative images, developed into unique forms that spread along with goods, influencing patterns in Central Asian textiles and even Chinese ceramics. Literature thrived too, with collections such as 1001 Nights, blending Persian, Indian, and Arab storytelling traditions, many of which traveled back along the Silk Road to inspire new tales. The scientific and cultural transmission of the Abbasid period was not one way, it was reciprocal. While Muslim scholars borrowed from Greek philosophy and Indian mathematics, their innovations later filtered back into Europe through Spain and Sicily, helping spark the Renaissance. The Silk Road thus became more than a marketplace for luxuries. It was a circuit of ideas, with Islam's intellectual centers serving as crucial nodes. The legacy of the Islamic Golden Age on the Silk Road was immense and enduring. For centuries, the knowledge cultivated in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba shaped the trajectory of global science, medicine, and philosophy. When Europe entered its so-called Dark Ages, the Islamic world served as custodian of ancient wisdom and innovator of new thought, ensuring continuity in humanity's intellectual journey. The medical works of Ibn Sina, for instance, remained standard references in European universities until the 17th century. Algebra, algorithms, and Arabic numerals, ironically originating in India but perfected in the Islamic world, became indispensable tools for trade and scholarship everywhere. Navigation techniques refined in Muslim lands, including the perfected astrolabe and improved maps, enabled later European explorers to chart new oceans, an indirect but undeniable outcome of Silk Road exchanges. Equally important was the spirit of inquiry fostered during this period. The blending of cultures, Greek rationalism, Indian numeracy, Persian administration, and Chinese technology, created an intellectual synergy unmatched in the medieval world. By connecting scholars through the arteries of the Silk Road, the Islamic Golden Age ensured that no single civilization owned knowledge. Rather, it was shared, debated, and improved upon collectively. This legacy lived on long after Baghdad's decline, embedded in the practices of merchants, sailors, doctors, and philosophers across continents. The Silk Road, therefore, was not only a path of silk, spices, and porcelain, but also a luminous highway of science, reason, and human curiosity, with the Islamic Golden Age as one of its brightest lights. The decline of the Tang dynasty in the late 9th century brought significant changes to the Silk Road. Internal rebellions, such as the devastating Lushan Rebellion, drained resources and weakened imperial authority. Banditry increased, border defenses crumbled, and Central Asian states broke away from Tang control. With land routes becoming less secure, merchants increasingly sought alternatives. While the overland Silk Road never vanished, its prominence began to wane during this transitional period. Instead, attention shifted toward maritime routes along the South China Sea and Indian Ocean. Coastal cities like Guangzhou and Quanzhou grew in importance, transforming into international ports where foreign merchants could trade directly with Chinese partners. The fall of Tang did not sever China from the Silk Road, but redirected its energies. As centralized power fractured, regional warlords and local rulers controlled stretches of the road, often taxing caravans heavily. Yet these difficulties also pushed innovation. Traders adapted by forming guilds and seeking protection through alliances, while others abandoned land routes for ships that could bypass political instability altogether. Thus, the decline of the Tang was not simply an ending, but a reorientation, one that paved the way for the Song dynasty's embrace of maritime trade. This transition reflected the Silk Road's resilience. When one artery narrowed, another expanded, keeping the lifeblood of commerce flowing across continents. The Song dynasty, 960 to 1279 CE, marked a turning point in Silk Road history by shifting the balance of trade from land to sea. Unlike the Tang, the Song were less dominant militarily in Central Asia and instead turned their gaze toward maritime power. They invested heavily in shipbuilding, navigation, and port infrastructure, transforming China into the hub of an expanding maritime Silk Road. Song ships, some equipped with multiple decks and watertight bulkheads, were technological marvels capable of carrying hundreds of tons of cargo across oceans. The use of the magnetic compass, first perfected in Song China, revolutionized navigation, allowing sailors to travel with greater accuracy and confidence. Ports such as Quanzhou became bustling centers of exchange, where Arab, Persian, Indian, and Southeast Asian merchants mingled with Chinese traders. Unlike Chang'an, which had been landlocked, these coastal cities looked outward, forging direct connections with the broader Indian Ocean world. The Song exported silk, ceramics, and increasingly porcelain, which became one of the most sought-after commodities globally. In return, they imported spices, ivory, cotton, and exotic woods. This maritime expansion not only revitalized commerce, but also redefined China's identity, positioning it as a naval and trading powerhouse. By prioritizing sea routes, the Song dynasty ensured that even as Central Asia faced upheaval, the Silk Road, now complemented by its maritime twin, continued to thrive. The rise of maritime Silk Road routes under the Song dynasty had profound cultural and economic consequences. Economically, the influx of foreign goods stimulated Chinese markets, while the export of Chinese ceramics, particularly blue and white porcelain, reshaped tastes across Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. The sheer scale of porcelain production in Song kilns demonstrated how maritime demand could fuel entire industries. Tea, too, became a significant export, gradually spreading beyond China's borders to become a global beverage. Culturally, the maritime exchanges created cosmopolitan port cities where mosques, Hindu temples, and Buddhist shrines stood side by side, reflecting the diverse origins of visiting merchants. Guangzhou and Xuanzhou became microcosms of the Silk Road spirit, filled with the sounds of multiple languages, the scents of foreign spices, and the mingling of artistic traditions. These ports were not only economic gateways, but also cultural laboratories where new cuisines, fashions, and ideas flourished. The Song government, unlike many earlier dynasties, actively supported this diversity, recognizing the value of trade taxes and diplomatic goodwill. Furthermore, maritime innovations such as standardized shipping documents and improved harbor facilities demonstrated a level of bureaucratic sophistication that encouraged trust among foreign traders. The shift to sea routes also linked the Silk Road more closely with Africa, as Chinese merchants traded with East African ports like Kilwa and Mogadishu, bringing back giraffes, ivory, and gold. In this way, the Song dynasty transformed the Silk Road into an even broader system of exchange, one that connected continents through the waves as much as through the deserts. The maritime turn did not replace the overland routes, but expanded the Silk Road into a global network that would set the stage for future centuries of interaction. In the early 13th century, the world witnessed the meteoric rise of the Mongols, a nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan, the Mongols forged the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from Korea to Eastern Europe. Their conquests were brutal, marked by the destruction of cities and the subjugation of entire peoples. Yet paradoxically, the Mongols also laid the groundwork for one of the most secure and expansive eras of Silk Road history. The Mongols' mastery of cavalry warfare allowed them to overrun established kingdoms with terrifying speed, breaking down barriers that had long divided Eurasia. By uniting vast territories under a single authority, the Mongols created conditions for unprecedented connectivity. Roads that had once been fragmented by warring states now came under imperial oversight. The Mongols established relay stations, known as yam posts, across their empire, where couriers could change horses and rest, ensuring rapid communication across thousands of miles. They also issued passports called paisa, granting merchants and envoys safe passage. This infrastructure transformed the Silk Road into a safer, more reliable artery of commerce. While Genghis Khan's campaigns brought destruction, they also erased political obstacles to trade, allowing goods, people, and ideas to flow more freely than ever before. The Mongols thus combined conquest with consolidation, giving rise to the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace and stability that revitalized the Silk Road and reshaped the global balance of power. The Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, lasted roughly from the mid-13th to the mid-14th century and marked the Silk Road's most dynamic phase. Under rulers like Ogedei Khan and later Kublai Khan, the empire established a unified administration that prioritized trade. Caravans could now traverse from China to the Mediterranean under the protection of Mongol soldiers, dramatically reducing the risks of banditry. Taxes were standardized, tariffs simplified, and corruption punished, encouraging merchants from across Eurasia to participate. The volume of trade skyrocketed. From China came silk, porcelain, gunpowder, and printing technology. From the Islamic world flowed glassware, textiles, and scientific instruments. Europe contributed woolen cloth, silver, and precious metals. The Mongols also encouraged the exchange of livestock and food products, introducing new crops and cuisines across regions. Their openness extended to foreign merchants. Genoese, Venetian, Persian, and Chinese traders were all welcomed at Mongol courts. Cities like Karakorum, Samarkand, and later Khanbaliq, Beijing, became bustling hubs of commerce and culture. The Mongols did not merely allow trade. They actively fostered it, recognizing that commerce brought wealth and stability to their empire. Moreover, they supported artisans and engineers, relocating skilled workers across their territories to stimulate production and innovation. The Pax Mongolica turned the Silk Road into the backbone of a truly global economy, where goods and ideas circulated with a speed and scale unseen before. This stability allowed Europe, the Middle East, and Asia to become more interconnected than at any other time in medieval history. The Mongol Empire's impact on the Silk Road was not limited to goods. It profoundly shaped cultural and intellectual exchanges. The Mongols were pragmatic rulers, often tolerant of religions and customs as long as loyalty and taxes were secured. This openness allowed Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and even Nestorian traditions to coexist and spread along the routes. Monks, priests, and scholars travel with caravans, exchanging doctrines and philosophies. One of the most famous travelers of this era was Marco Polo, whose journey from Venice to Kublai Khan's court in China epitomized the possibilities of Mongol-era travel. His accounts introduced Europeans to the wonders of the East, gunpowder, paper money, and sophisticated urban planning, fueling curiosity and later exploration. Similarly, Muslim scholars like Ibn Battuta traversed Mongol lands, documenting cultures and cities that highlighted the empire's cosmopolitanism. Yet the Mongols also facilitated darker exchanges, diseases. The Black Death, which devastated Europe in the mid-14th century, spread along Silk Road routes, carried by fleas on rats traveling with caravans. Even so, the broader cultural legacy of the Mongols was transformative. They introduced Persian administrators to China, Chinese engineers to Persia, and Central Asian doctors to Europe, creating a melting pot of expertise. They even experimented with postal systems and diplomatic missions that prefigured modern global institutions. Though the empire eventually fragmented, the Mongol century left behind a world far more interconnected. The Pax Mongolica proved that even the fiercest conquerors could become unlikely architects of peace, leaving a legacy of commerce, cultural exchange, and global awareness that echoed long after their decline. In the late 13th century, Europe's curiosity about the East reached a new height through the travels of Marco Polo, one of the most famous figures connected to the Silk Road. Born in Venice in 1254, Marco Polo was the son of Niccolò Polo, a merchant who, along with his brother Maffeo, had already ventured into the Mongol Empire before Marco's birth. The elder Polos traveled as far as the court of Kublai Khan, where they were received with great interest. When they returned to Venice years later, they brought back tales of the East that were so extraordinary they sparked widespread fascination. In 1271, Marco, then a teenager, set out with his father and uncle on a second journey that would take them across Persia, Central Asia, and into China. Their travels were arduous, involving deserts, mountains, and long caravan journeys, yet they eventually reached Kublai Khan's court in Khanbaliq, Beijing. Marco Polo spent years in the service of the Mongol ruler, acting as an emissary and traveling widely across Asia. He claimed to have visited regions such as Yunnan, Tibet, and even parts of Southeast Asia, gathering detailed observations of the lands he encountered. His journey represented not only personal ambition, but also the growing European desire to connect more directly with the riches of the East. Through Marco Polo, the Silk Road became more than rumor or myth for Europeans. It became a tangible path to unimaginable wealth and cultural discovery. One of the most remarkable aspects of Marco Polo's account is his description of Kublai Khan's empire. He marveled at the grandeur of the Yuan dynasty capital, which he described as a city of wide streets, bustling markets, and splendid palaces that surpassed anything in Europe. He noted the empire's use of paper money, a revolutionary concept unknown in Europe at the time, and its efficient postal system that allowed messages to travel with astonishing speed. Marco also observed the empire's religious tolerance, where Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and Taoists coexisted under Mongol rule. He recorded details of exotic goods, silk, porcelain, tea, and spices that filled the markets, as well as engineering feats like the construction of the Grand Canal, which linked northern and southern China. According to his account, Kublai Khan valued Marco's insights and employed him on diplomatic missions throughout the empire. Whether Marco truly held such a position is debated by historians. But what is clear is that his narratives captured the imagination of Europe. His portrayal of the East was not only about wealth, but also about advanced governance, culture, and knowledge. The very idea that another part of the world could surpass Europe in sophistication challenged Western assumptions. For centuries afterward, Marco Polo's account became the definitive European window into Asia, inspiring countless others to dream of making the journey themselves. His time at Kublai Khan's court symbolized the height of East-West engagement under the Pax Mongolica. When Marco Polo returned to Venice around 1295, after more than 2 decades abroad, his tales seemed almost unbelievable to his fellow Europeans. Captured during a war between Venice and Genoa, Marco recounted his adventures to a fellow prisoner, Rusticolo de Pisa, who wrote them down in what became known as Il Milione, or the Travels of Marco Polo. This book, filled with vivid descriptions of distant lands, came to be known in Europe as the Book of Marvels. It described not only China, but also India, Persia, and lands as far as Indonesia and Africa, blending first-hand observation with hearsay and legend. Many Europeans doubted its authenticity, dismissing Marco as a fabricator. Yet the work spread widely, translated into multiple languages, and copied across the continent. The book's impact was enormous. It broadened European geographic knowledge, fueled demand for Asian luxuries, and inspired explorers such as Christopher Columbus, who carried a copy on his voyage to the Americas. The travels also introduced Europe to ideas such as coal as a fuel, paper money, and grand cities that dwarfed those in the West. Whether entirely accurate or not, Marco Polo's account permanently altered Europe's imagination of the East. It strengthened the allure of the Silk Road and reinforced the dream of direct connections with Asia. In this sense, Marco Polo served as a bridge, not only between continents, but between myth and reality. His narrative helped transform Europe from a continent of inward-looking kingdoms into one ready to embark on the age of exploration. After consolidating power in China, Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, established the Yuan dynasty in 1271, marking the first time that all of China was ruled by a non-Han dynasty. The Yuan dynasty was not only a continuation of Mongol power, but also a distinct phase in Silk Road history, where China became more deeply integrated into a global network than ever before. Kublai Khan relocated the capital to Khanbaliq, modern-day Beijing, and transformed it into a hub of trade and diplomacy. Under his rule, China flourished as a center of production, exporting silk, porcelain, tea, and lacquerware to distant markets. The Mongols' policy of relative religious tolerance and their emphasis on infrastructure strengthened the Silk Road. Roads were repaired, postal stations reinforced, and merchants offered protection under the empire's banners. Kublai encouraged foreign visitors, including traders from Persia and envoys from Europe, to establish themselves in Yuan cities. This openness not only boosted commerce, but also showcased China's grandeur to outsiders, making the Yuan court a magnet for diplomats, scholars, and adventurers. By bridging Mongol military might with Chinese economic productivity, the Yuan dynasty ensured that the Silk Road reached its most vibrant state, one where goods and ideas flowed with unprecedented efficiency across Eurasia. The Yuan dynasty presided over a truly cosmopolitan empire where East met West in unprecedented ways. Cities such as Beijing, Hangzhou, and Yangzhou became bustling centers where merchants from across Eurasia gathered. Chinese silks, Celadon ceramics, and porcelain dazzled foreign traders, while in return, China welcomed Persian textiles, Indian spices, and European silver. The Yuan also integrated maritime and overland routes, ensuring that the Land Silk Road and the Maritime Silk Road complemented one another. This dual system expanded China's reach not only across Asia, but also into Africa, where Chinese ceramics and coins have been discovered in Swahili coast cities like Kilwa and Zanzibar. Yuan cities reflected this global integration. Muslim astronomers worked at observatories in Beijing, Persian doctors practiced medicine at the Mongol court, and artisans from Central Asia contributed to architecture and crafts. Even cuisine reflected this exchange. New ingredients like grapes, pomegranates, and chickpeas became part of Chinese diets, while noodles and dumplings travel westward. Foreign religions also thrived. Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, and Taoists coexisted, often patronized by the Mongol rulers themselves. The Yuan dynasty's trade networks thus created not only economic prosperity, but also cultural hybridity. These cosmopolitan centers embodied the Silk Road's spirit, a fusion of traditions that transcended geography, turning cities into living museums of global interaction. Despite its successes, the Yuan dynasty eventually faced mounting challenges that strained Silk Road commerce. Heavy taxation, corruption, and natural disasters weakened the dynasty from within. Popular discontent grew as peasants faced famine and rebellion. Externally, the empire's vast size made it difficult to control Mongol successors outside China, such as the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Golden Horde in Russia, gradually drifted into independent directions. Although trade initially flourished under Mongol unity, fragmentation reduced the security that that had made the Silk Road so attractive. Banditry resurfaced, political rivalries returned, and overland routes became less reliable. The maritime routes, however, continued to expand, softening the blow of overland decline. Still, the Yuan dynasty's legacy was profound. It had overseen one of the most interconnected eras in world history, where Europeans like Marco Polo encountered Chinese sophistication firsthand, and where Chinese goods reached markets as distant as Venice and Cairo. Even after the dynasty collapsed in 1368, replaced by the Ming, the memory of Mongol-fueled globalism lingered. The Yuan period demonstrated both the possibilities and vulnerabilities of a globalized system. Prosperity thrived under unity, but faltered with division. Yet the cultural and economic ties forged during the Yuan era left an indelible mark, proving that the Silk Road could not be extinguished by the fall of one empire. Its momentum carried forward, ensuring that East and West would remain bound together, even in times of turbulence. After the death of Kublai Khan in 1294, the once unified Mongol Empire began to splinter into separate khanates. While they all claimed descent from Genghis Khan, these successor states pursued independent policies, sometimes cooperating but often competing with one another. The four main khanates were the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia and the Steppe, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. This fragmentation weakened the central control that had ensured the Pax Mongolica, but did not immediately end the Silk Road's vitality. Instead, each khanate became a regional power, influencing specific sections of the route. The Ilkhanate controlled Persia and Mesopotamia, serving as the crucial link between East Asia and the Islamic world. The Golden Horde dominated the steppes of Russia and Eastern Europe, shaping the northern trade routes that connected to the Black Sea. The Chagatai Khanate, though less stable, remained important for Central Asian caravan routes. While political unity was gone, a common Mongol heritage and shared interest in commerce kept the arteries of the Silk Road open. Yet, cracks began to appear. Rivalries between khanates created instability. Merchants faced increased tolls, and coordination became more difficult. The fragmentation showed how delicate global networks were. Prosperity relied not only on geography, but also on political cooperation. Still, the Mongol successor states preserved much of the infrastructure and tolerance of their forebears, ensuring that the Silk Road remained a functioning, if less secure, bridge between East and West. The Ilkhanate, founded by Hulagu Khan in the mid-13th century, ruled over Persia, Mesopotamia, and parts of Anatolia. Its territory placed it at the very heart of Eurasian exchange, bridging the Middle East with China to the east and the Mediterranean to the west. The Ilkhan rulers initially maintained the Mongols' religious tolerance, allowing Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Buddhists to coexist. Over time, however, Islam regained prominence as the dominant religion, shaping the character of the state. Economically, the Ilkhanate became a vital link in the Silk Road chain. Persian artisans produced textiles, ceramics, and metalwork that were highly valued in both Asian and European markets. Persian cities such as Tabriz and Baghdad thrived as commercial centers where Chinese silks and porcelain mixed with European silver and Venetian glass. The Ilkhanate also played a key diplomatic role. It maintained contact with both the Yuan dynasty in China and European powers, even exploring alliances with Christian kingdoms against their common enemy, the Mamluks of Egypt. Though these alliances never materialized, they show how the Silk Road was not merely a commercial highway, but also a stage for international diplomacy. Culturally, The Ilkhanate encouraged the translation of Chinese, Indian, and Islamic texts, contributing to Persia's intellectual life. Despite frequent conflicts and eventual decline in the 14th century, the Ilkhanate ensured that Persia remained an indispensable gateway of the Silk Road, where East and West met in bustling bazaars and royal courts. While the Ilkhanate shaped the Middle Eastern Silk Road, the Golden Horde dominated the northern steppes. Founded by Bata Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, the Golden Horde extended Mongol influence deep into Eastern Europe and Russia. From its capital at Sarai on the lower Volga River, the Horde controlled trade routes that connected China and Central Asia to the Black Sea, from which goods flowed into the Byzantine and later Ottoman worlds. The Golden Horde's dominion gave rise to what historians call the Steppe Silk Road, where nomadic networks ensured the transport of furs, horses, and slaves to markets farther west. Russian principalities, though politically subordinate to the Horde, benefited economically from their position as intermediaries. Cities like Novgorod and Moscow gained prominence through their connections to steppe trade. The Horde's relative tolerance allowed merchants from diverse backgrounds, Muslims, Venetians, and Armenians among them, to operate across its lands. Yet the Golden Horde also demonstrated the fragility of Mongol successor states. Internal divisions, pressures from rising powers like Lithuania, and the eventual spread of the Black Death weakened its dominance. Still, for more than a century, the Golden Horde kept the northern Silk Road routes open, ensuring that goods and ideas continued to flow into Europe. It was through these channels that technologies, commodities, and even diseases reached new frontiers. The Horde's legacy lay not only in its political rule, but in its role as custodian of a key branch of the Silk Road, linking the steppes of Asia with the forests and cities of Europe. One of the most devastating episodes in Silk Road history was the spread of the Black Death in the 14th century. The plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, is believed to have originated in Central Asia, where rodents and fleas acted as carriers. With the Silk Road at its peak under Mongol successor states, the disease spread rapidly along caravan trails and maritime routes. Merchants unknowingly carried infected fleas in their packs, while ships docking at ports brought rats teeming with the contagion. The Mongol Empire's very success in creating interconnected networks ironically facilitated the pandemic's speed. From the steppes of Central Asia, the plague reached Persia, the Middle East, and North Africa before devastating Europe between 1347 and 1351. The results were catastrophic. Some regions lost a third to half of their populations. Entire towns were depopulated, economies collapsed, and trade slowed to a crawl. Caravans that once brought prosperity were now feared as carriers of death. People across Eurasia struggled to explain the disaster, often blaming foreigners, merchants, or religious minorities, leading to violence and persecution. The Black Death demonstrated the Silk Road's double-edged nature. It was a pathway of wealth and culture, but also of pandemics. The very connectivity that had enriched Eurasia became a vulnerability, showing how disease could spread globally long before the modern age. The Black Death's impact on the Silk Road was not limited to mortality. It reshaped societies and economies across continents. In Europe, labor shortages gave surviving workers new bargaining power, destabilizing the feudal order and accelerating social change. In the Islamic world, once thriving cities such as Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo experienced population collapse, weakening their commercial dominance. Central Asian caravan towns, once vibrant with traders, declined as fear of contagion reduced travel. The disruption of long-distance trade also shifted economic priorities. With the Silk Road increasingly dangerous, maritime trade routes became more attractive, offering safer and more controlled environment for commerce. Ports in the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, and the Mediterranean gained prominence, while inland caravanserais fell into decline. Socially, the plague left deep scars. Religious movements sought to explain or appease divine wrath, while communities turned inward, becoming more suspicious of outsiders. In China, the Yuan dynasty, already weakened by corruption and unrest, faced further destabilization as famine and plague fueled rebellions, eventually leading to its collapse and the rise of the Ming dynasty in 1368. The plague thus accelerated political and social transformations, marking a turning point in Silk Road history. While the routes never disappeared entirely, the economic center of gravity shifted toward the seas, laying the groundwork for the Maritime Age. The Black Death, in essence, was both a human tragedy and a catalyst for historical change, altering the balance of power in Eurasia. The memory of the Black Death lingered long after the initial outbreaks, shaping perceptions of the Silk Road and altering patterns of exchange. Fear of contagion made overland routes less attractive, reinforcing the shift toward maritime trade. Even when the plague subsided, the psychological impact discouraged large-scale caravan movements for decades. Communities once eager to welcome foreign merchants grew wary, imposing stricter quarantines and barriers. Yet, ironically, the plague also encouraged scientific and medical exchanges. Doctors across Europe and the Islamic world sought remedies, sharing knowledge that spurred advances in public health. However, the immediate effect was a decline in long-distance trade and the weakening of once great Silk Road hubs. Cities such as Samarkand and Kashgar, though never abandoned, saw reduced prominence compared to coastal ports. The plague also fractured religious and cultural confidence. In Europe, the devastation undermined trust in established institutions, contributing to changes that would culminate in the Renaissance. In the Islamic world, theological debates about fate and divine will gain urgency. In China, the plague's role in Yuan decline fed into the Ming's rejection of foreign influence, as the new dynasty pursued policies that initially restricted outside contact. Thus, the Black Death not only reduced populations, but also reshaped attitudes toward trade, foreigners, and global connections. The Silk Road, once celebrated as a highway of prosperity, now carried the stigma of death, disease, and danger. This profound cultural memory ensured that even as trade revived in later centuries, the overland routes never regained the same dominance, paving the way for maritime exploration and a new global order. With the fall of the Yuan dynasty in 1368, the Ming dynasty rose to power, determined to restore stability and Chinese cultural pride after decades of Mongol rule and the devastation of the Black Death. The Ming emperors initially sought to secure China's borders and reassert central authority, but they quickly realized that the Silk Road's overland routes had lost much of their former prominence. The fragmentation of Mongol successor states, combined with lingering fears of plague and instability across Central Asia, made caravans less appealing. Instead, the Ming rulers increasingly turned to the seas. Coastal ports such as Quanzhou, Ningbo, and Guangzhou regained importance, linking China directly to Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, and even East Africa. This maritime orientation reflected broader changes. Ships could carry more goods than caravans, travel faster, and avoid many of the political tolls and dangers of the inland routes. The Ming court's emphasis on maritime trade culminated in the famous voyages of Admiral Zheng. whose fleets carried Chinese prestige across the oceans. Though the Ming maintained limited contact with the remnants of the overland Silk Road, their focus on maritime routes signaled a new chapter. The Silk Road was no longer only about deserts and caravans, but about waves and sails. This shift preserved China's role as a central player in global commerce, even as the traditional overland Silk Road declined. Perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of Ming maritime power came in the early 15th century. When Emperor Yongle commissioned Admiral Zheng, he to lead a series of expeditions across the Indian Ocean. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng he commanded fleets of massive treasure ships, some of the largest wooden vessels ever built, accompanied by smaller support craft and tens of thousands of sailors, soldiers, and merchants. These voyages visited more than 30 countries, including modern-day Indonesia, India, Sri Lanka, Persia, Arabia, and the East African coast. Zheng's fleets carried silk, porcelain, and tea as gifts, while bringing back exotic items such as giraffes, zebras, spices, and precious stones. The expeditions were not primarily about colonization or conquest, but about showcasing Chinese power, establishing diplomatic relations, and expanding trade networks. Ports such as Calicut, Hormuz, and Malindi became key stops in this maritime Silk Road, where Chinese ships exchanged goods with local rulers. Zheng's voyages symbolized a high point of global interaction, demonstrating how the Silk Road had evolved into an oceanic system of exchange. However, after Yongle's death and shifting priorities within the Ming court, the voyages ceased and China gradually turned inward. Yet, for a brief moment, the Ming fleets projected Chinese influence across half the globe, reinforcing China's place at the center of a maritime Silk Road that stretched farther than ever before. After Zheng's voyages ended in the mid-15th century, the Ming dynasty adopted a more conservative stance toward foreign trade. Influenced by Confucian officials who saw merchants as disruptive to social order, the court restricted private overseas trade and focused resources on defending northern borders against renewed nomadic threats. The Great Wall was reinforced on an unprecedented scale, symbolizing this inward turn. As a result, the Silk Road's overland routes continued to decline, while maritime exchanges became increasingly dominated by private merchants and foreign powers, such as the Portuguese and later the Dutch. Despite official restrictions, the demand for Chinese goods abroad, particularly porcelain, silk, and tea, remained insatiable, ensuring that smuggling and unofficial trade flourished. Ming China's emphasis on high-quality exports shaped global tastes. Chinese porcelain became so prized that it was imitated in Europe and the Middle East. Meanwhile, silver from mines in Japan and later Spanish colonies in the Americas flowed into China, integrating it into an emerging global economy. The Ming's cautious policies thus had mixed effects. They limited state-led expansion, but could not stop China's role as a commercial giant. The overland Silk Road, once the lifeblood of Eurasian trade, had by this time lost its central importance, replaced by sea routes that spanned continents. The Ming dynasty's maritime era signaled both the end of the traditional Silk Road and the beginning of a new global trade system. Its impact endured as the patterns of exchange it fostered laid the foundation for the age of exploration and the rise of a truly interconnected world economy. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the Ottoman Empire emerged as a formidable power in the Eastern Mediterranean, gradually consolidating territories that once belonged to Byzantium, the Seljuks, and smaller Anatolian states. The Ottomans' greatest triumph came in 1453, when Sultan Mehmed II captured Constantinople, transforming it into Istanbul, the new Ottoman capital. This event not only ended the Byzantine Empire, but also shifted the balance of power across Eurasia. With Constantinople under Ottoman control, the empire commanded one of the most strategic choke points of the Silk Road, the Bosporus Strait, gateway between Asia and Europe. By dominating both overland and maritime approaches, the Ottomans could tax and regulate trade, ensuring immense wealth flowed into their coffers. Caravans traveling through Persia and the Middle East increasingly had to negotiate Ottoman tolls, while European merchants in Venice and Genoa found themselves paying higher prices for Eastern luxuries. Although the Ottomans initially welcomed trade, recognizing its value, their political and military dominance gave them the leverage to act as gatekeepers. This tightening of control gradually made it more difficult for Europeans to access the goods of the East, particularly spices, silk, and porcelain. As a result, the Ottomans played a paradoxical role. They kept the Silk Road alive by maintaining order in their territories, but their monopolization of routes also spurred Europeans to seek new alternatives, laying the groundwork for the age of exploration. Under Ottoman rule, trade routes across the Middle East remained active and vibrant, even as overland connections began to decline in relative importance. Cities such as Istanbul, Aleppo, Damascus, and Cairo became bustling centers of exchange where goods from Asia, Africa, and Europe converged. The Ottomans maintained caravanserais, fortified rest stops that ensured merchants' safety along inland routes. They also supported maritime trade through ports like Alexandria and Smyrna, linking Mediterranean shipping lanes with Indian Ocean commerce. The empire was a crossroads not only of goods, but of cultures. Turkish, Arab, Persian, Greek, Armenian, and Jewish communities all contributed to a cosmopolitan commercial life. In Istanbul's Grand Bazaar, merchants sold Chinese silks and porcelains alongside Persian carpets, Indian spices, and European glassware. Ottoman artisans themselves became famous for their ceramics, textiles, and calligraphy, much of which drew inspiration from Silk Road motifs. Yet, as maritime powers like Portugal and Spain developed direct routes to Asia around Africa, the Ottomans increasingly faced competition. While they continued to tax caravans and traders, the volume of overland commerce diminished. Still, the Ottomans retained their role as cultural mediators. Coffee, which originated in Yemen, spread through Ottoman lands to Europe, while New World crops like maize and tomatoes entered the empire through European trade. The Ottoman realm thus embodied the last flourishing of the classical Silk Road, even as global commerce shifted toward the seas. By the 16th century, the traditional overland Silk Road faced irreversible decline. The rise of European maritime powers had created new routes that bypassed Ottoman-controlled corridors. Portuguese navigators rounded Africa to reach India, while later the Spanish opened trans-Pacific connections from the Americas to Asia. The Ottomans still taxed what remained of the caravans crossing their lands, but their dominance of overland trade became less relevant as the world's economic center of gravity shifted toward the oceans. To Europeans, Ottoman tolls and restrictions were seen not only as economic burdens, but also as barriers to their ambitions, fueling efforts to establish direct contact with Asia. Thus, ironically, Ottoman control of the Silk Road indirectly encouraged the age of exploration, which would transform global history. For Asia, the decline of overland trade meant that cities like Samarkand, Bokhara, and Kashgar, once jewels of Silk Road commerce, saw reduced prosperity. Meanwhile, maritime hubs such as Goa, Malacca, and later Manila rose in importance. The Silk Road did not vanish completely. It continued to function regionally, but it no longer served as the central artery of Eurasian exchange. Instead, the term Silk Road increasingly became a memory of a golden past. Yet the Ottomans' role was crucial in shaping this transition. By monopolizing overland trade, they preserved its legacy for a time, but ultimately drove the world toward a new age of exploration, colonization, and global maritime empires. The closing of the Silk Road was thus not an abrupt end, but a transformation, with the Ottomans standing as both guardians of an old order and midwives to a new one. Though the overland Silk Road gradually declined with the rise of maritime empires and new trade routes, its historical importance cannot be overstated. For more than a millennium, the Silk Road was the closest thing to a global network, linking China, India, Persia, the Middle East, and Europe in ways that reshaped the destinies of entire civilizations. It was never a single road, but a vast web of routes, constantly shifting with geography, politics, and economics. What made it unique was not only the movement of goods, but the movement of ideas, religions, technologies, and even diseases. Without the Silk Road, Buddhism might never have reached China, Islam might not have spread as far east, and Europe might have remained unaware of Chinese innovations like paper, gunpowder, and the compass. The road was also the birthplace of financial and diplomatic innovations, letters of credit, passports, and embassies that foreshadowed modern globalization. In this sense, the Silk Road was not simply a prehistoric trade route, but the prototype of our interconnected world, showing both the benefits and vulnerabilities of global exchange. The prosperity of empires such as the Han, Tang, Abbasid, and Mongol was intimately tied to Silk Road commerce, while its decline reshaped the balance of power in favor of maritime Europe. Its story is not only about the past, it is the root of our modern globalized system. Perhaps the Silk Road's greatest legacy is cultural rather than economic. Along its deserts, steppes, and seas, people of vastly different backgrounds met, exchanged, and created hybrid traditions that survive to this day. Art was profoundly influenced. Buddhist cave paintings at Dunhuang show Persian motifs, while Chinese porcelain carried Islamic calligraphy, and Persian carpets displayed Chinese dragons. Music traveled too, with Central Asian instruments shaping both Chinese court orchestras and Middle Eastern ensembles. Religions found fertile ground on the Silk Road. Buddhism spread from India to East Asia. Islam reached Central and Southeast Asia. Christianity established enclaves far from its birthplace, and Zoroastrian and Manichaean influences colored regional beliefs. Culinary traditions likewise blended. Spices from India flavored Middle Eastern dishes, while noodles and dumplings made their way west. Even languages absorbed foreign words, creating vocabularies that reflected centuries of exchange. These cultural fusions remind us that civilizations are not isolated monoliths, but constantly evolving through contact. The Silk Road dismantles the myth of cultural purity, showing instead a shared human heritage born of interaction. Every caravan that crossed the desert, every ship that sailed across the Indian Ocean, left behind more than material goods. They left behind new stories, symbols, and ways of life that became part of the collective memory of humanity. The Silk Road's decline in the 16th century did not erase its significance. In many ways, its spirit continues today. Modern projects, such as China's Belt and Road Initiative, explicitly invoke the Silk Road to symbolize global connectivity. Air routes, shipping lanes, and digital networks function as the new Silk Roads, linking economies in real time. The lessons of the old Silk Road are still relevant. First, global exchange brings enormous benefits, but also risks. Just as silk and ideas enriched societies, diseases like the Black Death devastated them, reminding us of the double-edged nature of interconnection. Second, the Silk Road highlights the importance of cultural openness. Periods of greatest prosperity, Han China, Tang cosmopolitanism, Abbasid Baghdad, Mongol Pax Mongolica, coincided with tolerance, diversity, and curiosity, while eras of decline often aligned with isolation, intolerance, or excessive taxation. Finally, the Silk Road teaches that no single power can dominate global exchange forever. It shifts with geography, innovation, and human will. Empires rose and fell, but the road endured because people's desire to connect transcended politics. Today, as nations debate globalization, the Silk Road remains a reminder that humanity has always been interconnected, and that our greatest achievements often come when we embrace, not resist, those connections. Its legacy is not just silk, spice, or porcelain. It is the enduring idea that across mountains, deserts, and oceans, we are one world, bound together by exchange. And that brings us to the end of our epic journey along the Silk Road. Today, we've traveled with merchants and emperors, crossed deserts and oceans, watched religions spread and empires rise, and even witnessed the fall of routes that once defined the world. The moral of this story is clear. The Silk Road teaches us that humanity thrives when we connect, share, and learn from one another. It also reminds us that with connection comes both opportunity and responsibility, as prosperity and danger often traveled side by side. From silk and porcelain to ideas and philosophies, the Silk Road left us a legacy of cultural fusion and global awareness that still shapes our modern world. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to stay connected with History Teller YT, because every story of the past is a mirror for today and a guide for tomorrow. Join us again for our next adventure into history. You won't want to miss it. Until then, keep the spirit of the Silk Road alive in your curiosity and imagination.